Adam, we're talking about Jesus again.
Again? Gosh, this guy keeps coming back.
Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we look at protests and revolutions, past and present, and see what lessons we can take with us today. I'm Sam, and joining me, as always, is a man who loves cycling too much to be English, is too generous to be Dutch, and is definitely too vegan to be Swiss. Adam, how are you today?
I'm good. You know, you can get some pretty good vegan food in Zurich these days, but I'm fine. I'm trying to pack up all of my worldly possessions and send them away, which is just a barrel of laughs. So that's occupying a lot of space. Nice to be talking to you, Sam. How are you?
I'm good. It's finally summer here in California. It's been pretty cold until this week, and now it'll probably be hot for the next 3 months. The weather's really shifted since I was a kid, and now September is our peak heat.
Damn.
But anyway, yeah, you're leaving Amsterdam. That's a big chapter ending in your life. What are you going to take away with you from your years that you've spent there?
A bicycle and a renewed appreciation for just really good urban planning.
Good luck with the move.
Thank you.
Godspeed. Now, before we dive into our scriptures today, we have an Independence Day. Adam, I would like you to read the opening lines of a certain 20th century Declaration of Independence, but I'm not going to tell you which country it is yet.
Okay. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. The Declaration of the French Revolution made in 1791 on the rights of man and the citizen also states, all men are born free and with equal rights and must always remain free and have equal rights. Those are undeniable truths.
You want to take a guess at which country's declaration opens with these words?
Declaration of Independence. I'm getting a strong Cuba vibe.
Not Cuba.
Not Cuba.
Not similar geography, but similar ideology.
Okay, then let's go with Vietnam.
There you go. This was Vietnam.
Hey! Okay.
The hint there is that it addresses France and the United States.
Oh, of course it does. That makes a lot of sense.
And it was the legend Ho Chi Minh himself who read those words on September 2nd, 1945 in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi. I have a bit to say on this one. Ho Chi Minh, having spent a lot of his life in Europe, was strongly influenced by Enlightenment ideals and intentionally used French and American rhetoric in order to appeal for Vietnam's independence on the world stage. Some context around this day, the Viet Cong had seized power in the August Revolution about a week prior, and they had seized power from the Nguyen Emperor that had been placed as a puppet leader by the Japanese earlier that year in a last-ditch effort to maintain support in the region. September 2nd was chosen because that was when Japan was officially set to surrender to the US and end World War II. This declaration was proclaiming independence from both France and Japan. Ho Chi Minh knew he had a long road ahead towards true independence because the declaration ends with this line. The entire Vietnamese people are determined to mobilize all their physical and mental strength to sacrifice their lives and property in order to safeguard their independence and liberty. Now, Ho Chi Minh would die before the Vietnamese War against the Americans ended. He died in 1969. And the U.S. would not withdraw officially until 1973, and Vietnam would not be officially unified until 1975. But can you guess what day Ho Chi Minh died on?
Was it September 2nd?
It was.
Wow.
Though, in order to not dampen the celebrations of their national day, especially during wartime, his death was not announced until the next day.
Oh, interesting.
And it wouldn't come out until 20 years later that Ho Chi Minh actually died on September 2nd.
Wow, that's really cool.
I mean, it gives me similar vibes to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both dying on July 4th, 1826.
I didn't know that either. That's amazing. It gives me similar vibes to, admittedly, they're less similar than your vibes, but when Mount Everest was measured for the first time it was measured to be exactly 29,000 feet tall, but they reported back as 29,002 feet because they didn't think anyone would believe that they'd measured it exactly to be 29,000 feet tall.
I have heard that. I think I heard that from you like 10 years ago.
Could be.
But yeah, and I think it was either Jefferson or Adams, who notoriously hated one another, whose last words were that the other person lived, but the other person had died a few hours before.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, congratulations to Vietnam. I have been there. I've had the privilege to visit. It's a really amazing country, and I think it's one of the few places I've been in the world where I really feel optimistic about the future. Now, the bureaucracy of that government and the bribery involved these days may not be exactly what Ho Chi Minh had in mind, but it's still a really amazing place. And I think better suited moving forward than some other spots.
So keen to go to Vietnam. I want to get the train between Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, and I want to eat all the food that's there. So good.
Well, I've only been to the south, so let's hit that central part and northern part together. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
So congratulations to our comrades in Vietnam.
Congratulations.
As I mentioned at the top, Adam, we can't seem to escape the topic of Jesus or Christianity when I'm leading the episodes lately.
Guy's everywhere.
He's everywhere. And as I've said before, I was raised Catholic, and I'm no longer. I don't go to church at all anymore. But you wouldn't think that based on all these episodes, I guess. But I do think that this is an important topic because nearly every far-right fascist movement around the world seems to be invoking religion to justify their actions. Most of these being Christian regimes, at least nominally. Poland, Italy, Hungary, most notably the United States. They all have far-right governments that cite Christian morality as the basis for their lawmaking. Someone like Nigel Farage would reference Judeo-Christian values very often to describe what their countries need to return to after the moral degradation, quote-unquote, that has occurred. And though he still cites Judeo-Christian values all the time, Nigel Farage did say that he no longer attends church due to the, quote, Church of England's surrender to the woke agenda.
Yeah, famously progressive Church of England.
Yeah. And I sit here in the U.S., where Donald Trump has somehow managed to secure over 80% of the vote from evangelical Christians, which are America's most vocal and expressive Christian voting bloc. And this is hard to believe now, considering Trump's past and current nefarious deeds, and seeing as how that group viewed him in the primaries leading up to 2016. He seems more like an antichrist figure than a messiah figure, and we could do a whole episode on that, but I won't really dive too deep on that. But Trump evokes Christianity and Jesus every chance he gets. From here, it trickles into the daily conversations and sentiments of many Christians around America. So, like, you can write off what he says because it's ridiculous, but then it's parroted by so many people.
There's a great episode of In Bed with the Bright, which is another podcast, where they have on an expert, I can't remember his name, but they discuss Trump and the Epstein files, but not in terms of, like, is he in it? Because, of course, he is. But it's in the sense of, like, what the existence of the Epstein files and what its sort of political role means for people. And they really point it as it being quite a messianic thing in the sense that Trump has been promising, or perhaps specifically in the case of Epstein, more often other people have been promising through Trump, a revelation. And it is the act of revelation in itself that will be redemptive to the whole system.
Interesting.
And once go through that, I need to go back and listen to that episode because it's very complicated, but it really struck me as having a lot of truth to it in terms of how people view him as a figure.
Anecdotally, just having experienced the vocal opposition right wing under Obama and then seeing them now with Trump, because they were calling Obama the Antichrist for, no reason other than some email chains that pass along to your friends, your 10 friends. But the hoops that evangelical Christians jump through to still defend someone who has broken every moral tenet of their religion is pretty baffling to me.
No.
I've cited a few examples where Donald Trump evokes religion, other than just how his staff prays around him every day with the cameras facing him, obviously. That's all very weird and cultish. But After Navy SEAL Ryan Owens was killed in a U.S. raid in Yemen in 2017, Trump said that, quote, "The Bible teaches us that there is no greater act of love than to lay one's life down for one's friend," which obviously evoking the Bible to talk about an act of imperialism abroad is quite strange. His main spiritual advisor, Paula White, once defended his immigration policies, stating that, quote, "Jesus wouldn't have broken immigration laws. If he had broken the law, then he would have been sinful, and he would not have been our Messiah." Can't argue with that logic, right?
Yeah, Jesus loved the law. It was his favorite. Just always doing what Rome said.
He also notoriously wasn't a refugee as a child, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, Trump has consistently called Border Patrol's mission as, quote, "sacred." He has compared various investigations against him as being similar to Jesus' persecution.
Of course he has.
And obviously, he's got his own brand of Bibles that he sells. I think I've mentioned them to you before. They sell for like $80 and have gold leaf in them. That's the minimum price for them.
That's crazy. Are they made in America? I feel like they're not.
I don't know. Can you fact check that?
I'll have a look. According to the Associated Press, Trump's Bibles were made in China.
I just saw a thing today saying how a Chinese guy has made over $100,000 selling shirts that say boycott China to Americans.
That's very funny. Man, Chinese got a sense of humor. It's just like any business opportunity, they'll take it.
Business savvy.
Business savvy. It was like after the tariffs went out, these videos went viral saying like, "Oh, your Louis Vuitton bag, you can buy it direct from China for like $1,500 rather than $30,000. Here's how we do it." And everyone was like, "Oh my god, I'm going to buy this perfect Louis Vuitton bag." And he was exposing what a scam the luxury fashion industry is.
Yeah.
And the luxury fashion industry is a scam, but that video was also a scam because you can get it made for like $500, not $1,500.
Yeah. Speaking of Vietnam, go get some football kits there. I did.
Nice.
Anyway, enough about Trump.
Okay.
I'm here to say that he and all the other far-right Christians are wrong about Jesus. You'll hear these people either defending that Trump upholds Christian morals, or you'll hear Christians say that they don't mix religion with politics. You know, they say that Jesus should never be made political. However, we know that they are wrong because why? What is the catchphrase to our podcast?
Everything is political.
Everything is political. Everything we do, even the declaration of apoliticality, is political.
Yes.
But they're both wrong because I'm here to argue that Jesus was a leftist.
Okay. I'm down. Down to hear it.
His teachings are not capitalism's moral ally, but its enemy. And recently we've spoken about and to some Catholics who have embraced the idea of liberation theology. That being that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth should be best utilized to raise up the poor and downtrodden in society, often by trampling over existing wealth and power structures. We spoke about Pope Francis, who made it his mission to humanize the poor, whose humanity is so often overlooked. And we spoke to Ike Ndolo, who we know does not sing about or to a white capitalist Jesus. And that was a pretty enlightening conversation. I just wanted to ask your thoughts now that it's been some time and we've digested it a bit. What was your main takeaway from speaking to Ike?
I think my main takeaway from speaking to Ike was something that you do see from time to time where, you know, he religious guy and he was in the church and in a sense sort of stumbled into it, but was a devout man and is a devout man, but was looking around at what other people were doing and just going, "What the fuck? What are you guys talking about? What are you guys doing? This is not what we're all about." And just that strong sense within him of being like, "What the fuck?" was great. And of course the fact that he was a very lovely guy, really easy to talk to.
Awesome individual. We hope he'll be back on one day. Maybe as a substitute guest if one of us is ever out of commission for some reason. You're always welcome on, Ike, if you're listening. So what I'm saying here, Jesus, the anti-capitalist, has scripture to back this up. And it's not the Old Testament that evangelicals love to quote to scare others about the fires of hell. It's in the Gospels, which, as you know from us talking on other topics, are the main books, right? They're the canon events, as we've said before. These are the words directly said by Jesus, so the churches base their teachings off of these. I'm going to hit you with some scripture. This one is from Matthew 6:24.
Okay. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
There we go. And we have another one in the book of Matthew, and we'll get to the theme of that in a second. This one's your favorite, as I know from us mentioning in passing before, but I wanted to give some context. It's the camel through the eye of a needle.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
But I wanted to include a bit more so you could see the full context of this quote. Essentially, a rich man is coming up to Jesus and asking how he can best serve him.
Just then, a man came up to Jesus and asked, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life?" "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Jesus replied. "There is only one who is good. If you want to enter life, keep the commandments." "Which ones?" he inquired. Jesus replied, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony. Honor your father and your mother, and love your neighbor as yourself." "All of these I have kept," the young man said. "What do I still lack?" Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." When the young man heard this, he went away sad, because he had great wealth. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God."
And that part where he says it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, there's some translations where it says impossible, not hard. But yeah, were you aware of the context around that quote?
Of it being a young man asking Jesus? I don't think so. No, I think that's probably the first time I've heard it.
Yeah, I mean, these are both from the book of Matthew, and some context is Matthew was a tax collector, which in the Roman province was seen as one of the seediest jobs you can do because there was a stated tax that was informed to sort of the rulers of the province. It wasn't widely known, so they would commission people to collect the tax and say, this is the base we're collecting, but we're not paying you a salary. Whatever you can scrape off the top will be what you keep. So tax collectors were just doing really seedy work, trying to make the most profit off of people's taxes as they could. And Matthew talks a lot about money in his gospel because he was the money man. And, you know, whether he was an individual who wrote this down or many people, it was seen as though wealth was the barrier to a good life, to a pure soul. And that's something we see in a lot of religions, not just Christianity. You see that in Buddhism. That's like the clearest tenet of Buddhism. You see that in Islam as well. And you kind of just see it around different philosophies in the East, where materialism is usually the path that blocks clarity. As the anthropologist, do you concur?
That's present in a lot of religions, the renouncing of worldly things. Yeah, I think that's fairly common, certainly, and emerges in some communities as a way of sort of sharing resources throughout a community. There are some indigenous groups, the Kung in southern Africa, who don't own anything that they can't carry on their back. Partly because if they were, then they would have to stop being nomadic because they would have to store all their stuff somewhere. But the one thing that is like a truly rare resource, which is these arrowheads that they make that you can kind of store poison in, those are used as currency in this like gambling game that they have. And the rules of the game are such that once you've won quite a lot, you kind of can't play anymore. It's more of a mechanism than that. It's not a rule, but there is a mechanism in the game, which means that like you can only win a certain amount, and that you are pretty likely to lose them gambling over time. So they will spread throughout the the community. So you see this all over the place as a tool of social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
Although Nietzsche was like, that's bad. That's why people are poor. He thought that it was a bad thing.
Yeah, there are philosophers, but in philosophy you do see critics of that ideology saying that it's used as a mechanism of control, right? Okay, if you don't own anything, then who does? Probably the church, right? Or the noble.
Yeah.
That being said, the people we've seen in practice, like Pope Francis and the Jesuits, largely see it as the spiritual guidance, right? To have a clear mission, and the Buddhists, same thing, right? They see that as the obstacle in their way. Now, in Scripture, Jesus not only speaks about the accumulation of wealth, but he talks about redistribution. He talks about materialism in a broader context. I know there's a meme you really enjoy posting every year about being like Jesus and whipping people. What's the context for that?
Yeah.
Do you post it every Easter or Christmas?
I post it every Christmas, and it's something like, be Christ-like this Christmas, gather a group of friends and inspire them to anarchy, help out your local sex worker, beat up a politician, preach equality. It's like, I post it every year.
And it's accurate.
In honor of Christmas.
It's
yeah, for sure.
One of my favorite stories from the Gospels is when he goes to pray at the temple and he sees all of these tables leading through in the entryway in the courtyard to this temple, selling all these lavish goods, trying to sell the fattest pig or the fattest goats for sacrifice, all of these different little tools to help you get closer to God. And yeah, he flips out. He flips the tables, literally. He strung up his girdle and like made a whip of his cloth or something and starts hitting the people selling these items. And he says something along the lines of, how dare you turn my father's house into a den of thieves? I mean, I know someone that worked at an evangelical church. I won't say who for their privacy, but they worked at this evangelical church where they were tasked with selling the pastor's book after every service.
Wow.
And in my head, I'm like, this is very familiar.
In the UK, you just have the local parish church, and they always have a presence somewhere, but it's usually like a bake sale. They do a little bake sale outside the church to raise money for a new roof or something, and that always struck me as fine. That's okay.
Fine. In my experience in the UK, there's like one person being paid, and it's the pastor, and it's like not much.
And not much,
And there's like different old people that volunteer to sweep or sell coffee.
So exactly.
That's more of a communal thing. Hey, let's raise some money for, fix this door.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's fine. The church I'm referencing has that sort of big rock band production setup going on, and pastor has a multi-million-dollar house.
Damn.
But those evangelicals are the base of what we were talking about earlier in terms of voting conservative. And when I'm talking about Jesus advocating for redistribution, not only did he feed the 5,000, which could be a metaphor for feeding your community, but in the actions of his followers immediately following his departure from them, it's shown. In Acts 2:44, it stated that the first Christian communities, quote, had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and distributed them to all, as any had need. As any had need. Can you bring up the quote that's very similar to that?
To each according to his need, from each according to his ability.
Yeah, and I'm well aware that if I had had this conversation with you in the 1950s, I would be in jail. but yeah, that's one parallel I'm seeing here between the far left and the Bible itself.
Okay.
Jesus commands wealth redistribution and communal sharing. That's clear to me. That's structurally aligned with socialism. Now, Adam, why do many churches insist that he taught no economic model?
Well, I suppose the biggest reason would be that if they were to follow the economic quote-unquote teachings of Christ, then they'd have to give up a lot of their money, and they don't want to do that. But I also suppose there is an element that, like, I appreciate how you're phrasing all of this in terms of being aligned with capitalism or aligned with socialism, because, of course, he actually predates both, and there's sort of a feudal economy going on. And so I suppose you could have some pedant arguing it on those lines, but I think the main reason is just if you'd have to give away a lot of money.
The reason I'm phrasing it this way is because one side is weighing it very much in their favor. So I want to provide a counterbalance to what I think the messaging was. And that brings up my next question is, am I just crazy? Like, did Jesus demand redistribution and structural justice, or is that reading modern categories backwards?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've avoided doing that because of how you phrased it. Like, I think it is. I'd like if we were to just say Jesus is a socialist, I'd think that technically that's not true, right?
We might title the episode that for clickbait, but
Okay. It's not true because that category didn't even exist. Wouldn't even necessarily make sense in that context. It's a bit anachronistic. That said, he did seem to hold a lot of the values that modern socialists hold. He was perhaps a little bit more religious than modern socialists tend to be.
Mm-hmm.
What's the religion is the opiate of the masses?
Yeah, that could be interpreted a few different ways.
It could be, yeah.
And I think that the distance between socialism, communism, and religion is more circumstantial in how history shaped out, and maybe the initial acts of someone like Stalin and Mao trickling into wider movements and influencing other movements, because I feel that that's being sort of rectified in other ways now. You see, I think you shared the account with me where it's like Southern Catholic socialist or something, and you see a lot of priests and you see a lot of religious figures connecting these same dots that I've been saying. Maybe because the right wing has co-opted religion and saying that, hey, it can go the other way too.
Maybe, yeah. I think that there could be something there. I do think that this is one of the reasons that access to information is so important. We did an episode already about Protestantism and the reform of the church, but ultimately part of what spurred that was the development and popularization of the printing press. People were able to read the Bible and engage with it in their own language rather than having it gatekept by the priestly class. And once you actually read the messages yourself, there are certain conclusions that you're more likely to come to.
That's true, and ultimately it's the critical thinking that develops people down that road. I think the problem is, now that we have information at our fingertips, you see more people willingly giving up their critical thinking, which is quite worrying, and I don't know how to necessarily combat that part.
Yeah, that's tricky. I'm very anti-robot.
Yes.
Very anti-ChatGPT.
We're an anti-robot podcast. As we mentioned, except for Bender. He can stay.
Except for Bender. Bender can stay, yes. and Wally.
Sure. I'll keep my eye on him.
Okay.
But that being said, all of this reference to scripture and what Jesus said and how that's been interpreted over time, what does that mean for believers, agnostics, and atheists working for economic revolution today?
I suppose it means that they're up against some tough odds, right? Like there's been a lot of time spinning the messaging in the other direction.
I think that we are seeing through some things. Like people actually believed, well, and still believe, in trickle-down economics, right? And what came with trickle-down economics was the prosperity gospel in America. I don't know how widespread this was around the world. I don't know if Thatcher's England bought into this, but Reaganomics and prosperity gospel were one in one, which was like these rich pastors, these rich people that went to church had everything they had because God granted it to them, and that people were poor because God didn't give them the same.
There is definitely a link there. Thatcher was heavily inspired by self-help, and not the genre. The original self-help book is called Self-Help, and it was by a guy called Sam Smiles in the late 19th century. And I believe that he was quite inspired by prosperity gospel, and it developed there. The notion of the elect, right? That God's chosen will reveal themselves through material success. There was also a reinterpretation of the phrase, easier for a man pass a camel through the eye of a needle, in the idea that a needle were these narrow gates that were in Jerusalem or somewhere, and that you'd have to take some of the excess saddlebags off a camel. But no, that's not true. They were never called needles.
Yeah. That's what I mean, jumping through these metaphorical hoops.
Oh, yeah.
This type of thinking was also used to defend white nativism and still is used to defend white nativism. But the Gospels explicitly preach against this. There's the famous story of the Good Samaritan that's told by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Do you know this story?
Yeah, there was a man fallen over in the street, not very well, and people walked by and saw that the man was not well, but someone thought that he might be dead, and if he was dead, then they wouldn't be allowed to go into the temple. Another person was frightened, and then one man, a Samaritan no less, and you should, and the implication was normally you wouldn't be trusting Samaritans. But this Samaritan was a good Samaritan, and he checked on the guy in the street, and he was okay. Was he okay? I can't remember.
He was okay. The Samaritan nursed him back to health.
Oh, great.
Now, the crowd was shocked as well when Jesus told this story. They're clutching their pearls, couldn't believe it. But this story celebrates foreigners, essentially, and upholds their dignity as well. And the context for this story within the Bible actually comes from a bit earlier. Remember when he's talking about love thy neighbor, right? And then the crowd is saying to him that they do love their neighbor. And then Jesus asked, and who is my neighbor? Because to them, it was just their community. And he says, no, it's everyone. We talked about J.D. Vance's feud with Pope Leo over this topic as well in a previous episode. Yeah, so we have all these lessons coming straight from the man himself.
I do think something, regardless of whether or not it's appropriate to apply the label of socialist to Jesus, I think something that is pretty clear-cut is that if he was to emerge in, for example, the United States today, the evangelicals, Republican Party, even a lot of liberals would hate him. They would despise this man.
For sure. No question about it at all. That's something my dad has kind of said, like, my whole life. But
right, yeah.
Not even just that one side. He's just like, everyone would hate him. So. Now, Adam, there have been many people to connect the dots of Jesus' teachings to socialism or Marxism before. I'm not unique in that regard. And I wanted to point to a few examples of liberation theology in action. But first, we need to talk a little bit about the context of it, which we've mentioned a little bit before. Liberation theology, the term comes from Protestantism, and that is much older. That applies to abolitionist movements. That applies to a lot of Black people and what they were experiencing in the U.S. and other places during oppressive times, and turning to theology. Not only liberate them in a spiritual sense, but in a materialist sense as well. Like Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor by trade, right? Yeah. But he was the most iconic civil rights leader.
For sure.
That, as I've said before, that came later in the Catholic Church, the idea of liberation theology. And it originated in the 1950s and 60s, especially after Vatican II, which was the council where they notoriously switched from Latin to vernacular for their mass, giving Martin Luther that win, after all, as we said. And in 1968, the Medellin Conference of Latin American Bishops. At the time, South America, Central America was really facing ravaging economic policies inflicted upon them by the U.S. And a lot of South America and Central America was seeing dictators pop up backed by America in order to extract the resources from their countries. And at this council, the bishops themselves were realizing that the church had long sided with the elites and the colonial regimes, but this new movement aimed to see the world through the eyes of the poor. This was heavily influenced by Marxist class analysis and a few other thinkers like Paulo Freire's.
Pedagogy of the Oppressed, yeah.
Exactly. I haven't read it. Have you?
No, it's waiting for me in Bristol. I'm going to read it before I start teaching. I read recently Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks, which was deeply inspired by Paulo Freire.
Nice. Well, maybe you can guide us about that message in the future. Now, why may churches or states view this type of ideology as dangerous, even though it's a theology, not a political movement per se?
Because if I'm understanding liberation theology at its core, and part of this was from when we chatted to Ike, who's pointing out, it's about actually just following the teachings of Christ. If you do that on your own, you don't need a church to tell you how to do it, right? You can just read the book and see what he says.
Right. Yeah. Good point. I mean, that's essentially how the Reformation began, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
But I wanted to point to two individuals in particular that embodied two different elements of liberation theology at this time in Latin America. The first was Camilo Torres. I can't roll my R's right now. Camilo Torres, he was a sociology professor at the National University of Colombia and a Catholic priest in Colombia who joined and became the leader of the Marxist guerrilla group, ELN, which stood for the National Liberation Army of Colombia, in 1965. Now, he didn't lead it for very long. His main message was preaching effective love as solidarity with the oppressed, even if it meant armed struggle. So this was the part that the Vatican really was against, that he was resorting to violence and inspiring violence from others in order to help the oppressed. And the reason I say he didn't lead this group for long was because he died in his first battle in 1966. But in doing so, he became a martyr for liberation theology. And this inspired many young people and priests to use him as a rallying cry for their cause. Can you read this quote by him that has become pretty infamous?
If Jesus were alive today, he would be a guerrillo.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Jesus showed himself to be standing with the oppressed. He all his friends were the marginalized people, lepers, sex workers, tax collectors. And he was never shy about being seen with them. And certainly not shy about putting his body on the line for what he believed in, right? Famously, yeah. But this raises a core question for revolutionaries today. And it's one that certainly you and I have not stepped over this line. But it does raise a question about revolutionary movements. That is, when does nonviolence end and armed struggle become necessary? I'm reminded of the JFK quote, which is, when non-violent change becomes impossible, then violent resistance becomes inevitable.
Is peaceful change still possible in a lot of places around the world these days?
I mean, in some areas, sure, and in some places, yes. It's becoming less and less possible in a lot of places, and I think that we've in various places we're seeing the consequences of that. I think that the easy one to draw attention to is the home of Christ himself, Palestine, which had exhausted every opportunity, and the ongoing violence is a result of the oppression that they continue to face in Palestine.
Yeah,
right, and it's actually doubling down of that oppression because ostensibly there was some violent resistance to it, but I would hesitate to even categorize violence against violent oppressors as violence, because it's not a like for like exchange of things. The violence of the oppressed is not equivalent to the violence of the oppressor. Or there's no equivalence between what Hamas is able to do versus the Israeli state, but it is also different in kind, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there are still rooftop clubs going on every night in Tel Aviv.
Oh, yeah.
That also brings up a point that I've noticed when it comes to, I think we've touched on this before, but the lack of class consciousness here in America, in that this summer has been particularly violent in stories that aren't necessarily making the news, but if you look for them, you can find them, where there's a lot more gun violence than is normal, even for America. And part of that, I feel like people are just at their wits' end materially, but don't have the outlet for their frustration to vent to. So people are just getting violent without the appropriate target, I suppose, if there is one. Not that I'm saying there is one. Wink.
Wink.
There's one more individual I want to point out, and that is Oscar Romero. And he is kind of on the other side of liberation theology, that he fought for the same thing as Camilo Torres. But he was the Archbishop of San Salvador in El Salvador, and he was initially quite conservative and quote-unquote apolitical. We know apolitical is not a thing, right?
Yeah.
But he was actually transformed by witnessing state violence, especially the murder of his friend, Father Rutilio Grande. He became outspoken against El Salvador's dictatorship and the U.S. funding of their military, and he spoke out very consistently with this messaging. But as a result, he was actually assassinated during Mass by a right-wing death squad in 1980. I say he's on the other side of the liberation theology in that he wasn't in the jungles physically fighting. He was just there preaching, and his message was seen as a threat to the powers that be. I do have a quote that kind of sums up his position politically.
Peace is not the product of terror or fear. Peace is not the silence of cemeteries. Peace is the generous, tranquil contribution of all to the good of all.
And I think that kind of rings to what you were saying about Palestine as well, in that to one side of the conflict, they see the silence of a cemetery as the peace they're looking for, which is not the way we really should be going about things, right? Now, does Oscar Romero's murder show how much institutions fear even symbolic resistance?
I don't know if it shows that per se, but I do think that the murder of Oscar Romero is evidence that the regime is weak, because even if they don't like his message, if the regime is strong, they don't need to kill him. Oppressive states are ultimately weak states because they lack more sophisticated means of maintaining that power. They lack the ability to enact biopower, to effectively communicate hegemony. And so if a preacher spreading a message is enough to get you killed, that's not a particularly powerful state that you're competing against.
Very true. Now, the last bit of liberation theology I want to touch on is something that is near and dear to your heart, which is mutual aid. This is specifically the formation of Christian mutual aid networks that appeared during Latin America during this time as a result of liberation theologians. These popped up in grassroots forms, in collectives, and especially in places like Brazil, Nicaragua, and Peru. They emphasized self-organized political education, collective action, but a lot of this was done under the guise of like Bible studies, where they still did study the Bible, but they were kind of talking about it in the way that we're talking about it now. And it also provided that cover for them to organize. Women played huge roles, often becoming de facto leaders of these movements. In Nicaragua, these movements helped lay the groundwork for the Sandinista Revolution, which we don't have time for today, but maybe we can get into it another time. But it was essentially a revolution against the U.S.-backed dictatorship there. Now, Adam, do you think these types of movements, the small, decentralized, even spiritual and political types of movements, could be a model for building leftist power today in this resistance that we need?
Yeah, I think that mutual aid networks absolutely can be working on local scales. In part, I think it is harder to spin them as explicitly political. It's possible, but I think it is harder to do. But what you can do is give people some breathing room, right? These networks exist to provide people with things that they need, right? Food and social support services and stuff like that the state is unable or unwilling to fulfill. And by producing these networks, you give people just the little space they need so that they may be able to then be a part of a movement, be a part to organize, or indeed to see that the ideals of this organization are working on their behalf in their material interests.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that plays into the think global but act local. You got to look out for your neighbors. And who is your neighbor, as Jesus asks, right? In reality, it's the person right next to you. So you got to make sure they're doing okay and help them out in any way you can, which has become very difficult to connect with your direct neighbors in our increasingly online world, let alone the divided world we have.
Yeah.
Now, there was backlash, not just in the form of death squads and U.S. CIA operations, but there was backlash within the church against liberation theology, notably from very important people in the church. Pope John Paul II, who was the Pope for most of this time, was very against this, even though he was seen as quite a relatively progressive Pope for the time. His right-hand man in being sort of an inquisitor against liberation theology was a man known as Cardinal Ratzinger from Germany, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. He was probably the most outspoken opponent to liberation theology within the Vatican. A lot of philosopher-type priests were silenced, censured. Some were even stripped of the priesthood a lot of them around places like Brazil, especially, because the church ultimately feared communism's rise because that would lead to a loss of their own authority, because they'd seen it happen in places like Cuba, they'd seen it happen in the Soviet bloc. So ultimately the Vatican had chosen sides in the Cold War, and it was on the side of Western Europe and the United States. This meant the US also was very willing to back any counterinsurgencies, even at a spiritual level, and help the Vatican where they could in this as well.
That counterinsurgencies at a spiritual level is a great take.
Well, I have a quote for you from the Inquisitor himself, Cardinal Ratzinger, on his take on liberation theology.
It is an error to think that the liberation from sin should be subordinated to liberation from social conditions.
I think that take is pretty whack. How about you?
So he's saying that sinfulness is entirely separate from the material realm?
He's saying that these priests that are improving social conditions or attempting to improve social conditions are losing their mission, in that they should be
right, they're not focusing on sin. Okay. Huh, yeah, pretty whack.
Benedict XVI was all about sin and the fires of hell and whatever. All
old school.
Yeah, very old school. Also stuff that's not really in the Bible, or at least not in the Gospels at all. But that leads to this, well, two questions. What do you think scared the Vatican more, Marxist ideology or the fact that the poor were organizing on their own terms? Or are those the same thing?
Well, I suppose often they were the same thing in these specific examples, but I think that the poor organizing on their own is probably the biggest scare there, because without that, I mean, Marxist ideology without action is just a book club. And they'd already got a book club, so maybe that's what they were worried about. People going to this other book club. I don't know, now that I say it.
I mean, I often view leftist organizing today in a few separate categories. And I feel like sort of the rich kid academic Marxist is kind of left alone by the powers that be, because they're seen as largely quite toothless. Whereas, I mean, just looking at a family example, looking at the United Farm Workers, the Mexican farm workers largely, who marched with Cesar Chavez to improve working rights in the 60s. That was seen as a very dangerous movement because it meant less profit on vital things like food.
Yep.
To bounce off this, I guess having all of this context, and we did mention liberation theology and how Pope Francis was inspired by it at the time, because he wasn't an active participant during all of this, but he was learning a lot from it. Does this context make Pope Francis's papacy seem any more radical to you than it already was?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was aware that Benedict the 16th was not a particularly jovial fellow, was not a progressive guy. But I suppose I'm interested in the levers of power by which then Francis became Pope. I know that the conclave is sort of notoriously...
I am too, man. I have no idea.
Obscure. But yeah. But presumably there was a movement within the church itself who was looking around at Ratzinger, at Benedict, and were like, oh, this is a bit much, isn't it? Shouldn't we be helping the poor out a little bit? And which led to Francis, presumably.
Well, it would seem that people like Camilo Torres and Oscar Romero had more fans in the church than maybe was perceived at the time they were living. Who knows? Well, I guess we'll never know how the conclave works. But it is a very radical shift that the church took in that short amount of time. Because we were alive when John Paul II was Pope.
Yeah.
We were born into that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to close out here with some of my final thoughts on liberation theology and I guess the socialist Jesus we've kind of painted today. Liberation theology and its radical priests ask to see faith not as private piety, but as public protest. From Camilo Torres' rifle to Romero's martyrdom and the community's organizing collective struggle, this is religion as revolution. To those of our listeners who do call themselves people of faith, can we not also ask, if the far right are trying to bend faith to their cause, can the left not do that as well? To me, spiritual conviction lies on the side with moral high ground, the side that wants the poor to be housed, fed, and treated with dignity. How do we bring that spirit into our modern struggles without both church and state crushing it? This is what some of us need to ponder. Any closing thoughts, Adam?
I know we say nothing is apolitical, everything is political, but in a sense, religion as a category is a neutral tool, right? That can be used for progressive causes, can be used for conservative causes, depending on the spin that you put on it. The degree to which the teachings of a central religious figure, a Messiah, the Christ in this case, is the sort of be-all and end-all of religion is debated and depends a lot. The traditional view is that religion is about belief. Certainly within anthropological circles, that is a highly challenged belief, and indeed the idea that religion is often more about what it does socially, community roles, community expectations, things like that can all come into effect and can play at different levels here. But insofar as we desire religion to be another vehicle for liberation, for people's liberation, that is what we want on this podcast, then I do think we do need to encourage the specific studyings of the teachings of Christ. And if you are a religious person who is listening, I encourage you to look into some of these cool liberation theologists, see how they use their faith to help people out, and maybe question how you can do that as well. I think that getting involved in a mutual aid group in that way is really beneficial. I know that there is I have a friend here in Amsterdam who was a sex worker for a long time and now is trained to be a social worker to help women who want to leave that kind of work, and does that through the church. But because the old church is right in the center of the red light district in Amsterdam, it's 750 years old and grew up around sex work in the city for centuries gone by, and it's done without a sort of chaste shame to it, but more as a sort of social service that is provided, and I think that's great. And if we can have more explicit organizing off of things like that, then I think that could be a great thing as well.
Yeah, and I think maybe what traditional leftists can take away as well is, I mean, from my own personal story, like, I don't go to church anymore. I was like very involved in that back in the day. I'm still a fan of the historical Jesus, as you can tell from the quotes I've chosen, right? I'm still a fan of that person that is portrayed, whether or not they're the Son of God. That's irrelevant in what they're saying to me. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe some more traditional leftists can see that side and use that as a bridge to connect with their community members, they can ally with, right? I think we can take all the help we can get with people that are like-minded, and whether or not you're the same religion as them is kind of irrelevant, because you might want the same things and you might have the same exact morals. Anyway, I know I wanted you to close out with those thoughts, but that was...
No, I love it.
But I really appreciate your insight, Adam, because this has been quite a few episodes on religion, and you've allowed me to kind of explore that side, especially of a lot of Catholicism, because I've kind of had that in the bank in terms of my experience. We'll have one more episode that I'll lead us on, but it's not going to be explicitly about theology. We're in for more of a palate cleanser, and that'll be the Taiping Rebellion.
Oh, yes. Looking forward to our 4-hour episode on the Taiping Rebellion. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, our hardcore history Taiping Rebellion episode that I'm currently reading 2 books on.
Damn. Okay, I'm excited.
But, that being said, can you close us out with a very famous quote from another liberation theologian? His name is Helder Camara, former Archbishop of Olinda and Recife in Brazil. I guarantee you'll have heard this one before, Adam.
When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist.